Hi, I wanted to continue my series about different nations' militaries and military policies by looking at Sweden. Particularly ever since Sweden began joining NATO and joined NATO, a lot of people have been asking about, like, well, what kind of military does Sweden have? Is it any good? Does it offer anything? What does Sweden bring to the table with respect to NATO? Does Sweden's military make any sense? Does it meet Sweden's requirements, particularly, again, now that it's in NATO? So I want to talk about all this in my video. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, and military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe. It really helps. And if you feel so inspired, feel free to throw me some money using the thanks button on the YouTube. Also, you can click the link, which is in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. Also, through YouTube, you can become a member. And if you become a member, you are part of a very elite group of the coolest people on the planet. And if you already are a member, thank you very much. You're absolutely wonderful, and you really do a lot to help me be able to keep doing this channel and to maintain the effort, because it actually really does take a lot of time. So let's get to it. So I'm going to divide this video into 4 parts. I'm going to talk about part 1, Swedish military history and military policy historically. Part 2, current Swedish military policy. Part 3, an overview of the Swedish military today. And then part 4 is going to be basically concluding remarks, putting it all together. Okay, so let's get to part 1, Swedish military history and historical military policy. It might be a surprise to you that not that long ago, Sweden was a major military power. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Sweden came to rule over much of what is today Finland and parts of Russia, not to mention bits and pieces of the Baltic coast, and sometimes Denmark and Normandy, and even sometimes Germany. Sweden's big breakout moment, though, was the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, during which time King Gustavus Adolphus conquered much of Poland and the Holy Roman Empire. Now, what he hoped to achieve with his military adventurism, I think it's hotly debated. He certainly seems to have wanted to create this very powerful Protestant league against the Habsburg-led Catholic countries. He wanted to exercise influence over that Protestant league. He wanted to have influence over northern Germany. And he also wanted to keep the battles with the Catholic League very far from Sweden himself. He said something to the extent of, better to fight them over here than fight them over there than to fight them over here. At any rate, he was a very ambitious man. He was also a very successful military commander, and he might have accomplished a lot had he not been killed in 1632 at the Battle of Lutzen. Now, as it was, though, Sweden emerged with large chunks of land with bits of the Germanies, as well as the region of Livonia, which covers what today are the Baltic states. So here I'm showing you a map of Swedish possessions. This is roughly, as of like 1700. We've got the core green areas of Sweden and Finland, and then the bits that were conquered during the 30 Years' War and beyond. So we see parts of Norway and Livonia to the right, and Karelia, and Viborg, and Ingria, and also bits of the Germanies. And also, one other thing worth noting in this map is that Russia does not have any access to the Baltic Sea. So it's basically kind of like a Swedish lake to a very good extent. Anyways, over the course of the 18th century, a lot of this territory got chipped away. And the beginning of the end of Sweden's empire, certainly its empire, I'm going to coin a word here, Cis-Baltic, is that a word? Okay, was its defeat by Russia at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, which I'm sure you all know all about. Just joking. Anyways, finally, Sweden lost much of its territory outside of its borders, today's borders of Sweden, during the Napoleonic Wars, and that was sort of the big blow. So beginning of the end 1709, and then sort of the slow decline into the Napoleonic Wars. And the biggest loss of all in the Napoleonic Wars was Finland, which Russia managed to conquer. Now, the bright side, from Sweden's point of view, was that in 1814 it gained control of Norway, which it held on until 1905. Now, perhaps the most important outcome of the Napoleonic Wars, however, from the broader perspective for Sweden, was the military policy that it adopted in 1812, which was the concept of neutrality, or to be more blunt, well-armed neutrality. So this involved maintaining a substantial military, prioritizing defensive capabilities to deter threats from powerful neighbors such as Russia, which is always enemy number one for sort of post-Westphalia Sweden, and then later Germany. Now, the emphasis was on a citizen army, conscription, and coastal defense rather than any kind of expeditionary offensive warfare capabilities. Sweden stuck to this policy from 1812 until 2022, when it began the process of joining NATO. Now, for nearly all of this time, up until the very present, Russia, I would argue, was Sweden's number one enemy. And Germany, or the Germanies, or the Holy Roman Empire, or some permutation thereof, was either a first, second, or second threat, depending on what's going on. Certainly, in the 17th century, Russia was almost a nothing, whereas the Holy Roman Empire is very powerful, or at least the Habsburg were powerful. But then things kind of changed, and basically for the modern era, though, it's really Russia that was the number one enemy. And then Germany, though, with the unification in 1871, suddenly edged closer. I think it still remained the second, number two enemy, but closer. And you could see how, you could easily see how for Sweden, this now all becomes a game of maintaining a balance of power, a balanced relationship between Russia and Germany. The existence of Germany is good to the extent that it's a counterbalance to Russia, but you don't want to get involved. You don't want to be on either side. You don't want to get entangled in either side. So it's a very careful balancing act. And this is very important also for understanding Sweden's policies in the 20th century with World War I and World War II. In World War I, Sweden stayed out of it, although arguably it leaned towards Germany, and it helped to restrict the flow of supplies to Russia. Sweden also is a major supplier of iron ore to Imperial Germany's industry. Swedish ore is famous. During World War II, Sweden also stuck to its neutrality and played a careful balancing act between Germany and all the Allies. Remember, Germany had conquered very early on Norway and Denmark, so Sweden was in a very vulnerable position. So, on one hand, Sweden supplied iron to German industry and allowed German troops and supplies to transit through Sweden between, for example, Norway and Finland. There also were more than a few Nazi sympathizers in Sweden. I've heard from Swedes that there were more Nazi sympathizers than anybody chooses to admit. There were some 200 to 300 Swedes who joined the Waffen-SS. On the other hand, Sweden provided the Allies with valuable intelligence, and they commendably harbored 10,000 Jewish refugees, including nearly the entirety of Denmark's Jewish population and the Norwegian Jews who fled Norway once the Nazis began deporting Norwegian Jews to the concentration camps or the death camps. After World War II, Sweden continued to maintain this neutral position, although there's ample evidence to suggest that Sweden's neutrality was more in name than anything else. It was always very deeply in bed with the United States and with NATO, because for Sweden, it was always very clear that Russia was the real enemy. And I think to some extent, and I saw this with some of the Swedes, some of the debate about NATO, when the Swedes were talking about, no, we can't end our policy of neutrality, it served us well. I think to a great extent they're just kidding themselves about how neutral Sweden really was, in part because the Swedish government, successive Swedish governments, I think actually kind of lied to the Swedish people about the extent of their working cooperation with the United States and NATO. But either way, it's true that, at least in form, they maintain the policy of a well-armed neutrality. So let's switch gears then and talk about the Swedish military policy during this whole period. Now, as I said before, Sweden after 1812 was all about this heavy armed neutrality. This meant that Sweden maintained robust military capabilities, with the exception of the period immediately after World War I and up until the late 1930s. This is when Sweden largely disarmed and placed its faith in the new League of Nations. The rise of Hitler, however, and subsequent international crises convinced Sweden that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. So they started to rearm. And the key thing here was the Defense Act of 1936, which boosted defense spending dramatically to from about 37 million in 1936 to 322 million by 1939. I believe that works out to about 8% of Sweden's GDP at the time. Swedish spending peaked in 1942 at $527 million, which is about 12.4% of GDP at the time. Sweden did reduce its defense spending at the end of World War II, but nothing like World War I. So basically, it maintained, even though spending came down, but it maintained a high baseline that would be the norm throughout the Cold War. And so throughout the Cold War, Sweden was very heavily armed. It was conscription-based military, but with lots of stuff and lots of money being spent. So Sweden spent between 3 to 4% GDP during most of the Cold War. only dropping to 2.5% at the very end of the 1980s. And this is a lot of money. And one of the things that they did was they invested in quality over quantity. So they had a lot of things, like a lot of fighter planes and tanks, but they really wanted to make sure that these were very good fighter planes, very good tanks, and really very good everything. So they invested a lot also in their own defense industry, which they figured that as neutrals was very essential for them to maintain their autonomy and to maintain their capabilities, but also make sure that they had weapon systems that were really tailored for Sweden's particular requirements. This is why Sweden has such a great defense industry, including they make their own fighter jets and submarines and armored vehicles, and today really is one of the world's most sophisticated arms industries. Absolutely. My favorite examples of the fruits of Sweden's defense industry are the Viggen fighter jet and above all, the Draken fighter jet, which I think is just super cool. I remember when I was a kid, I was completely obsessed with the Draken. I used to draw it all the time, or try to draw it. I just thought this is as neat as it gets. That's the perfect fighter jet. They were built for Sweden's requirements, which meant they were built for home defense as opposed to force projection. They also thought that in order for Sweden to fight and survive a defensive war, they needed to be able to disperse their forces. So they designed their fighters to be able to operate from small auxiliary bases scattered throughout the country, as well as from roads. This is a requirement that persists to this day. So even today's Gripen are designed to be able to do this. They also made some really cool armored vehicles. I always thought that the S-Tank was super cool. Again, this, when I was a kid. The main virtue of the S-Tank, by the way, is that it has an extremely low profile, especially when it's in a hull down position behind some kind of berm or a hill. So, and also because it doesn't have a turret, besides the fact that it's very low to the ground, this also makes the thing lighter, so it's more maneuverable and it's faster. I can't leave this topic, though, without bringing up the real ugly duckling, but the real marvel, perhaps, of Sweden's armor industry, which is the BV-206. This thing here, which is beloved by many militaries. The French have it, the British have it, the Americans have it, I'm pretty sure the Germans have it. It's really great. Everybody, it's apparently just the thing that you need when you're dealing with snow or lots of mud, or it will go absolutely anywhere. Okay, so obviously the end of the Cold War brought with it a significant reduction in Sweden's defense budget. The military budget was about 2.92% of GDP in 1980. It dropped to about 1.82 in 2000, and then dropped to as low as 1.13% in 2014. And one of the key changes during this period was that Sweden dropped the whole concept that had been the underlying concept, the core concept of Swedish defense policy since 1812, 1814, 1815 was territorial defense. You're defending the homeland. In this post-Cold War context, they dropped that because there was no more threat to the homeland, so you don't need to do that. So the notion is now, instead of this conscript army designed to slug it out, let's say with the Russians, what you need is a smaller professional force. So they got rid of conscription that would be used in expeditionary international context. So they would go to Mali as part of the MINUSMA and the European Training Mission, EUTM. They went to the Balkans. And they dissolved units. As I said, they ended conscription and just became a much, much smaller affair. All of that did start to change in 2014 with the beginning of the Ukraine war. Collective defense slowly began to percolate, like people started thinking again about that. Oh, maybe collective defense isn't over with. And then spending started to creep back up towards 2%. It is, and then finally you've got the big invasion in 2022, and that's when things really turned on a dime. And that's when spending went back. I think it's at 2.4% and is now set to reach 3.5% GDP in 2030. In 2017, Sweden brought back conscription. And then finally in 2022, I believe they started the process of joining NATO, and they are now in NATO. NATO, by the way, joining NATO is also important from the point of view of modernization. When you join NATO, you need to meet certain NATO standards so that you can interoperate with everybody. And in a way, joining NATO is useful as a forcing function for modernization. It forces you to spend money in order to modernize your stuff, to get your stuff up to NATO grade. Okay, so current Swedish military policy. The focus of Swedish defense clearly is on the threat from Russia, and this is all because of the Ukraine war. Although it does mention, the documents I've seen do mention Iran and China, but still, it's ultimately about Russia. Sweden has a domestic security service, and on their website, I found an interesting text because I think it really very clearly shows what the Swedes are thinking about. The text itself says this, and this is from the website. The war in Ukraine continues to impact the social situation in Europe and Sweden. The outcome of Russia's war will affect the threat to Sweden in terms of Russia's risk appetite as concerns influence operations and sabotage against targets on the West. Now, this is talking, because this is a domestic intel thing, this is talking about the domestic threat, but still there's this basic idea. The outcome of Russia's war will affect the threat to Sweden in terms of Russia's risk appetite, Russia's willingness to cause trouble, to get up to shenanigans, whether that means doing influence operations or terrorism or sabotage or a war, another war, attacking another country. Either way, Swedes believe, and I've seen this repeated several times in their documents, this idea that this is what's at stake, and this is why Sweden needs to help Ukraine fend off the Russians, because the Russians can't take from the Ukraine war the conviction that they got away with it and that this was worth their while, and then guess what? They can try this kind of nonsense again somewhere else, right? That's really bad. The Swedes discuss their national security strategy in terms of what they call a total defense. And this total defense concept is the idea that it's not just a military responsibility of responding to the Russian threat, but that this involves the whole of society. Thus, there's a military defense pillar to the Russian threat, and then there's a civil defense pillar. And the core piece of legislation here that I want to call your attention to is this document called the Total Defense Bill for 2025 to 2030, which the Swedish Parliament passed in December 24. Among the things that are in this bill, this piece of legislation, is the commitment to spend up to 170 billion kroner, whatever it is, by 2030 for military defense, which means raising defense spending to 2.6% of GDP by 2028. I read that. Sometimes they say like 2.5 by 2030. The way you still get the idea, which includes procurement of new air defense systems, armored vehicles, military satellites, and upgrades to the naval forces and the air forces, et cetera, et cetera. I found in that document, or one of these documents, this following charts from 2025 showing what's going on with the defense budget. And you can clearly see it here. It's sort of flat. It's low and flat, relatively speaking, 2014, 2015, 2016. It starts to inch up. And then finally, 2022, things start to really catch on in terms of momentum. And now we're looking towards 2.6% by 2030. So in terms of the military defense side of this, we won't talk about the civil defense part, but really I should make that the subject of a different video, because a lot of countries in Europe are coming up with some really interesting civil defense ideas in terms of thinking about the internal threat that ultimately is tied to Russia. So the military defense side of this is that they want Sweden to have the capability to defend Sweden against armed attacks, to assert some sort of deterrent value because of its ability to defend the territory, to assert Sweden's territorial integrity, to protect the rights and national interests beyond Sweden's borders in accordance with international law, to fulfill Sweden's commitments to NATO as a NATO member within the framework of NATO's collective defense and other duties, to promote Swedish security and prevent and manage conflicts and war by carrying out peacetime operations on our own territory or in our neighborhood, and to take part in international peace-promoting operations, and to protect society and its functionality by providing assistance using existing capabilities and resources during peace and a heightened state of alert. So the core principles of territorial defense boil down to deterrence and defense, wanting to make sure that the price of attacking Sweden would be greater than any potential gains. And therefore, the military is structured in order to try to do that, to defend the territory. But also, it's geared to be able to rapidly mobilize and to sustain operations. So quick to start up, reservists are called up, the thing's mobilized very quickly, and then once it's mobilized, it can sustain these operations for as long as possible. And they're hoping to be able to reach a force of, I've seen different numbers, but 130,000 personnel in the wartime organization by 2035 is one thing that I've seen. And one way that they intend to do that is by expanding the annual conscription to up to 12,000 people by 2035. There's also one last bit. There's this also interesting bit about there's a geographic focus that these strategic documents in the bill identify. There is a new attention given to two areas. There's Gotland and the west coast of Sweden, which they think is particularly sensitive and important for maintaining lines of communication. Now, Gotland is an island smack in the middle of the Baltic. It is considered, the Swedes consider this to be strategically vital for their own defense interests. There has, as far as I know, there's always been a military establishment on Gotland. It's a fortified island up until After the Cold War, when Sweden began to reduce the military presence on the island, and in 2005 it actually reduced the last of the forces that were stationed in Gotland. Because of the Ukraine war in 2014, Sweden decided to start to reverse that policy. So in 2016, it sent troops back to Gotland. It remilitarized the island. And Gotland now hosts an entire reinforced mechanized battle group, complete with CV-90s, STRV 122 tanks. Those are Swedish spec Leopard 2A5s, something like that. So they're very good Leopards. It's just a Swedish variant of the Leopard 2. I've also read that the Swedes have stationed Patriot missile batteries on Gotland and advanced early warning radars. And the troops in Gotland also have RBS-70 short-range air defense missiles, which are basically manpads. Okay, so part 3, overview of the Spanish military. I found this very difficult to come up with exact numbers, particularly because a lot of the documents I read are not clear if whether or not they're talking about a particular branch or all of the military, and there's sometimes a confusion in the sources. But this is what I've been able to deduce, and I hope this is basically right. So the total size of the Swedish military is 89,000, which is 46,000 active duty. You have 9,000 civilians, and then 34,000 reservists. So for the size of the army itself, just so we're going to focus now, look at each branch. You've got 20 to 23,000 soldiers total, of which 8 to 9,000 are active duty, which is a fairly small number. 11 to 13,000 are reservists, and this includes something called the Home Guard, and then they've got 1,000 to 1,500 civilians. In the 1980s, the Swedish Army has as many as 180,000 people in it. That number shrank after the Cold War. By 1995, it was 80,000. By 2004, it's down to 60,000. In 2013, it had shrunk to a total of 16,000. And also by 2015, it boasted only a single mechanized brigade. 2022 changed everything. Sweden revived the operational division, so now you've got a division, and then now there are going to be 4 brigades underneath the division. We've got 3 mechanized brigades and 1 infantry brigade. Plus, there's the Gotland Battle Group, which is stationed permanently in Gotland. There are also several specialized battalions, including an artillery battalion, an air defense battalion, and an engineering battalion, etc. I've read that Sweden now plans to add 2 more brigades by 2030, which are described as subarctic brigades intended to operate in the far north. One thing that I found interesting that I can deduce about the Swedish Army's general approach to territorial defense and its operating doctrine is that while during the Cold War the focus was on defending the homeland, Swedish soil, now the focus is more on force projection beyond Sweden's borders to the region, to the neighborhood, to the Arctic and the Baltic littoral, which means that Sweden's forces are now geared to fight not in Sweden itself, but in Norway, Finland, and in the Baltic states. It's geared more for offensive maneuver than it was before. NATO integration fits into this concept. So Sweden plans to fight Russia as part of a team fighting alongside its neighbors and ideally on the territory of its neighbors rather than in Sweden itself. Another thing that remains the same is the emphasis on quality over quantity, with the view that Sweden's military will always be outnumbered, but it can in part make up for the difference by being qualitatively superior, to have large quantities of top-shelf equipment and now increasing quantities of high technology. So if you look at the Army, that's in fact what you see. You see a very well-armed force with really top-of-the-line, top-grade stuff. Sweden today has 110 main battle tanks, which are going to be upgraded to the Leopard 2A8 status, plus they're buying 44 new Leopard 2A8s on order. And so there's going to be a total of 154 Leopard 2A8s in its inventory when all of this is done. They also have about 500 CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles with 50 on order, so this should bring them up to about 550 of the CV-90s. These are, I don't entirely understand why, but people have high regard for the CV-90s. Is basically like, this is the end-all be-all infantry fighting vehicle. And, you know, that's what they say, like, hey, the Brits were silly for developing theirs, for going with the German Boxer when they should just buy the CV-90. A lot of people think that everybody should just buy CV-90s because this thing is so well regarded. I don't know, maybe it is, but it's good. Anyways, so they've got 500 of those. They also have 346 armored personnel carriers of various forms, mostly Patria, which I believe is a Finnish design and build. They also have 26 self-propelled howitzers with 48 more in order. These are the Archer self-propelled howitzers, which are highly regarded. They've got more 40 self-propelled 120 millimeter mortars. They've ordered 40 more, etc., including there's a 120 millimeter variant of the CV90. That's one of the things that they're ordering. And then a whole bunch of they've got these CV90 variants with an anti-aircraft gun. So 30 of these with a special radar. It's a LVKV90 radar guided air gun, whatever. Self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, that these days is something that everybody's discovering is what they really need. Like, this is very useful for counter-drone operations. And for short-range air defense, they've got IRIS, TLS. They have medium-range air defense. You've got the Patriots, and then they also have the man-pads that I mentioned earlier that you have in Gotland. So it's very well-equipped. This is a very well-equipped, up-to-date army. For the Air Force, it's a small force. You've got 4,500 total, which includes 3,300 active, 700 reservists, and 500 civilians. So the big-ticket items for the Air Force, the most important thing, the real backbone of the Swedish Air Force is the Gripen. They have about 94 of these things. They're really, really very good. They are built specifically for Swedish requirements, and so then anybody else looking at them might need to ask some questions about, like, okay, this makes sense for Sweden, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for anybody else. But either way, it's very good and it's highly regarded, and the newest versions are considered as good as any other Gen 4 4.5 fighter jet out there, so it's in the running with the F-16s of the world and the Rafales and the Eurofighters, etc. They also have these AWACS planes, 2 of them. These are, and they've ordered 3 more. We're talking, these are Saab planes with Saab electronics. They're excellent. Turning very quickly to the Swedish Navy, the size of the Navy, it's larger than the Air Force. It's 12,600 total, 5,000 active, 6,600 reservists, and 1,000 civilian. Sweden's Navy is very small, but it is sophisticated, as you might expect from everything else I've been saying. I think that the most interesting aspect of it is that I would say that the Swedish Navy can be described in 2 words. Do you want to guess what they are? Jeune Ecole. And I put a link in the description, or a link somewhere up here to a video in which I talk about the Jeune Ecole. The Jeune Ecole was this late 19th century view school that came out of France that basically said, hey man, there's like no point in competing with the Royal Navy with their giant battleships. What we really need to do is we need to use the latest technology, which in those days was the torpedo, and build these very small, fast, steam-powered torpedo boats that can dance around the big enemy capital ships and sink them. Because the reality is that a small, cheap torpedo boat with a bunch of torpedoes can sink a gigantic, super expensive battleship with like 500, 600 people on board. That's the reality. So don't try to match them battleship to battleship. Just do these small things, and the small things will make sense for coastal defense. So don't try to meet the enemy in open battle on the high seas. Try to keep open your coast using these small forces. Now, I have no evidence that the Swedish Navy was in any way influenced by the Jeune Ecole. There's no explicit connection that I am aware of. I did do some looking, but I didn't find any. Either they read about it and were influenced but never acknowledged it, or maybe they simply developed their own ideas, their own variant on their own entirely independently, which certainly makes sense. But the bottom line for the Swedish Navy, the modern Swedish Navy, has always been that you have small, cheap, fast things that can protect Sweden's coast and prevent invasions by being able to take down larger and more expensive enemy vessels. So the modern Swedish Navy has not gone for large surface combatant forces. It's gone for small corvettes, missile boats, and submarines. Sweden does manufacture its own diesel-electric submarines. And it's all about coastal defense rather than trying to go out in the high seas, which I think makes a great deal of sense. The current fleet, we have 1 Södermanland class submarine, which is a fairly standard diesel-electric submarine, and then 3 Gotland class submarines, again diesel-electric, and then they've got 5 Visby-class corvettes, which are undergoing a program to update its defensive capabilities. We have 2 Gävle-class corvettes, which are basically fast attack aircraft with anti-ship missiles. 2 Stockholm-class patrol boats. These are classified as patrol boats, but they also have anti-ship missiles, so basically it's a fast attack craft, very Jeune Ecole. In the future, they want to bring in 2 of a new class of submarine, the Blekinge, I don't know how to pronounce it, class, and the Luleå 4 of the Luleå class corvettes. Again, these are small, light, fast, with anti-shipping capabilities. Okay, so part 4. Let's put it all together. Some concluding remarks. Sweden, I think, very clearly counts among the European nations that takes seriously the threat represented by Russia and the need to respond to threats by having robust military capabilities. There's like no delusion here about the need. I mean, you look throughout the entire Cold War, and they might have played games in terms of pretending what side they were on, but at the same time, they spent a lot of money, and Sweden during the Cold War had this very large and very capable military. Like everybody else, they sought a peace dividend by cutting the military and by sort of writing off the need for robust defensive capabilities. The Swedes were not alone in this, but the Swedes were also relatively quick to understand that, once Ukraine war kicked off, that maybe they were wrong about all that, and then maybe they needed to reverse course. And it went so far as to convince the Swedes that it was time to abandon the policy of neutrality, which dated to 1812. And so they went and they joined NATO. So then the question is, all right, so if you bring this all together, it's very clear that Sweden thinks of this idea that they need their defense military in order to deter Russian aggression. They also want to contribute to coalition defense and to contribute to the defense of their neighbors, which means they have to have a large enough and sophisticated enough army to be able to make a useful contribution in terms of land warfare. They need an air wing, an air force that likewise can make a useful contribution. And they need naval capabilities that at the very least going to keep the Swedish coast clear, but also with ramifications for keeping clear the lines of communication into the Baltics and through the Baltics. So, focus on Denmark and the Straits. And if you look at it all from that point of view, the only thing that you would want to challenge is, like, for the Swedish Army, for example, is the Swedish Army really large enough to do what it needs to do? Because we're talking 4 mechanized brigades. It's not really an awful lot, but still it's something. And also, from a point of view of the equipment that these things have, which is basically state-of-the-art Leopard 2s combined with these CV90s that everybody thinks are the cat's pajamas, plus the Archer self-propelled howitzers, right, and the other kind of thing. It's a really impressive army. This is a first world, top-tier army in terms of its capabilities. And certainly everything I've ever heard about the professionalism and the training and whatnot, it's all top-notch. The Navy could be larger. The Navy, you wonder how much influence can this kind of fleet wield. Like, there's not a Navy that's designed to conquer or to control the Baltic. It's really more about defending the Swedish coast. Is that enough? But maybe it is. Maybe that already contributes, because maybe they, plus the Finnish Navy, plus the Polish Navy, plus the Danish Navy, plus the English Navy, the Royal Navy, right? Plus the U.S. Navy, maybe, this all adds up to enough. So I think so. I get the impression, though, that ultimately what the Swedes are getting for the money is something that's absolutely appropriate, that they're investing in real defense capabilities that they've always had, except for, right, the years immediately after World War I, and then the early 2000s. And what they're doing also is falling in line with Swedish military policy, at least since the good old days of the great conquests of the 16th century and the 30 Years' War, in terms of being a serious military power, albeit the relatively small size of the country. Sweden now has an advantage that it didn't have over its 17th century incarnation, which is that Sweden today is a lot wealthier than it was in the 17th century. Back before the Industrial Revolution, Sweden was relatively poor, just because it's poor agriculturally speaking, that sort of thing. Industrialized Sweden is a much richer country. So 2%, 2.5%, 3.5% of GDP for Sweden today is a lot of money, and that buys a lot of military capabilities, which is exactly what the Swedes are now doing. If you like this video, again, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you really very much for watching this. Also, again, if you feel so inspired, throw some money my way through the thanks button or the buy me a coffee, or consider becoming a member. And please stay tuned, because there's plenty more in the pipeline. Oh, in the description, before I forget, you're going to find links to my Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn accounts, as well as my Substack, also the same name, Pax Americana, which I write for more or less every week. And of course, last but not least, my own website, michaelshirkin.com. And that's it. Thank you. I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye.